And thank you very much for attending the webinar. We all know the food industry is dealing with a variety of control systems. And you're all familiar with HACCP, H-A-C-C-P. That is a system that's used to proactively control food safety incidents. Now, two more systems have been added recently to the list of control systems, namely TACCP and VACCP. Sorry about that. Two more control systems have been added recently to the list of control systems, namely TACCP, that is Threat Analysis Critical Control Point, and VACCP, Vulnerability Analysis Critical Control Point. These are to proactively mitigate the risks associated with malicious contamination and economically motivated adulteration. TACCP is essentially for malicious contamination, and VACCP, vulnerability assessment, is essentially for economically motivated adulteration. Well, my name is Rama, and I'm the Vice President for Food Safety, Product Safety and Research for Perry Johnson Registrars. We such as SQF, BFC, IFS, and things like that. Okay. Now, I have two objectives for the webinar. One, to introduce you to the new and emerging concepts of threat analysis, critical control point, and the other one is vulnerability assessment and critical control point system. Okay, and of course, the second objective is to provide the necessary information and tools to developing and implementing the VACCP system that will meet your specific requirements. Let us understand the acronyms first. As I mentioned to you, you're all familiar with HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point System. That is the backbone of any food safety management system to prevent accidental contamination to food products and materials in the food industry. Okay. And it has been there for years, actually. Now, the second one is Threat Analysis Critical Control Point, that has the acronym TACCP, is again based on risk management principles, and HACCP is an emerging methodology. I mean, this is based on HACCP. And this is an emerging methodology to detect and mitigate the risks associated with deliberate or malicious contamination. Okay. And I will try to explain the process and steps involved in developing the TACCP system, TACCP system. Okay. I will also explain how the current HACCP system can be effectively used to develop and implement the TACCP system, and how it can complement the current business risk management systems. Okay. Now, VACCP, food fraud is a growing problem in the international food trade. Though food fraud is mainly driven by economic consideration, it has food safety implications too. It has direct impact on food safety also. Okay. Recognizing this fact, the Global Food Safety Initiative recommends the food industry to carry out vulnerability assessment at the appropriate points in the food chain to identify and evaluate vulnerabilities and take appropriate steps. On this slide, I have given the definition of food fraud, which is a collective term encompassing the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, food ingredients, or even food packaging, labeling, product information, or false or misleading statement made about a product for economic gain that could impact consumer health. that has direct implication on consumer health. This I have taken from this reference. Actually, I've given the reference at the bottom of the slide. Let's see the definition of food vulnerability. This is nothing but susceptibility or exposure to a food fraud risk, which is regarded as a gap or deficiency that could place consumer health at risk, if not at rest. So this is a definition of food fraud vulnerability. This is what I call is a food risk matrix. Again, this has been taken from the reference I've given at the top of the slide. This food risk matrix differentiates between unintentional and intentional risks to food. Food safety and food quality issues are categorized as unintentional risks, and food fraud and food security are intentional risks. So you have intentional as well as unintentional risks. The motivation for food fraud is mainly economic gain. So what drives food fraud? It's nothing but motivation to make more money, actually. And food security, it is harming the public for creating terror. Okay. Controls do exist to tackle all these risks. Okay, what are the tools? Food quality risk, for instance, the tool is food quality management system. What about food safety risk? You have food safety management system, and HACCP is the backbone of that. The tool for food fraud risk is vulnerability assessment, whereas the tool for the food defense risk is threat assessment. Okay. GFSA has defined the food safety management umbrella to include HACCP, TACCP, and VACCP, TACCP, VACCP, and I have given the objective of these systems. Actually, HACCP is to prevent unintentional accidental adulteration, whereas TACCP is intentional adulteration. It is behaviorally or ideologically motivated, whereas VACCP, which is again intentional adulteration to mitigate the risks associated with food fraud, is economically motivated. GFSA has defined their food fraud scope to cover a wide range of risks, wide range of incidents. So this is again food fraud. What can contribute to food fraud? So I have given on the slide several things. This includes adulteration, which is, which could be dilution, substitution, concealment, unapproved additions, etc., etc. Mislabeling, here it is, mislabeling. This includes, parallel trade and diversion of products, etc. It could be smuggling, it could be theft, and also counterfeiting. And they're all associated with the food fraud system, actually. And each type of the incident could lead to public health risk. All these things, dilution, substitution, concealment, mislabeling, theft, etc., all these things could lead to food fraud. There are a number of deliberate acts against food and food supply, which is economically motivated. Okay, economically motivated adulteration, EMA, and malicious contamination. As a matter of fact, profit motives drive EMA, economically motivated adulteration, to gain an increased income from selling a foodstuff in a way which deceives customers and consumers. This may be either passing off a cheaper material as more expensive one, or it may be that a less expensive ingredient is used to replace or extend the more expensive one. Though the intention of EMA, which is economically motivated adulteration, is not to cause illness. The actual motivation is not to cause illness or death, but invariably that may be the result. So the common factor in many cases of EMA is that adulterant is neither a food safety hazard nor readily identified, as this would defeat the aim of the attacker. Okay, EMA definitely presents a great threat to food business, and there are a number of examples. I can give you several examples. Say, for instance, use of Sudan dyes to produce attractive color in spices, actually. And you know, there are several such examples, but anyway, we are going to see some of these examples later. Yeah, so these are some of the recent examples of economically motivated adulteration. The first one happened in China, melamine in milk powder and pet foods. Melamine is nothing but a nitrogen-rich industrial byproduct. This was actually added to dairy products by some milk firms to increase the apparent protein content actually. So milk payment, fresh milk payment, is mainly through the solids content and protein content. So some smart farmers actually added melamine, which is nitrogen based, to milk, and that increased the protein content. Of course, they got paid more, but that resulted in serious food safety incident. As a matter of fact, some 290,000 children got affected, and that resulted in 6 deaths. Okay, so if you are importing milk powder from China, obviously you'll be looking for the presence or absence of melamine. So another example of economically motivated adulteration is addition of certain dyes, coloring substances, to ingredients such as spices and candy, etc., etc. Lead, in fact, lead chromate, which has got a very good, a beautiful yellow color, has been an adulterant in turmeric for a number of years. Okay, again, if you are importing turmeric, obviously you'll be looking for the presence or absence of this particular dye. Lead chromate, which is a coloring substance. Similarly, paprika, again, lead oxide. And in Hungary, for instance, Sudan 1 was used to add, I think they detected the presence of Sudan 1 in orange red powder, etc., etc. Because these are, some of these things could be carcinogen also. Okay. This is an example of malicious contamination. 2005, a major bakery reported several customers had found glass fragments and, in fact, even sewing needles inside the wrapper of bread loaves. Okay, that was intentional contamination. Again, 2013, a major soft drink supplier was forced to withdraw product from the marketplace because that contained mineral acid, again, inedible material. So like that, there are some examples. And examples of extortion. I said there are, food fraud has several components. This is one of the components, actually, extortion. In 1990, a former police officer was convicted of extortion, and he actually contaminated baby food with glass. A police officer intentionally contaminated baby food with glass, and he demanded money from a multinational manufacturer of the product. 2008, a person was jailed because he threatened to bomb a major supermarket and contaminate its product. So basically, in order to get money from these companies, people use all these tactics. What about espionage? This is an example, actually. I'm not going to go through each and everything, but in July 2014, Reuters reported that a woman was charged in the country, in USA, with attempts to steal patented USC technology as part of a plot to smuggle some types of specialized corn for use in China. So basically, it's industrial espionage. Again, these are some examples of criminal contamination of food products, 1997, 1980, some examples actually. I'm not going to, because due to time constraints, I'm not going to go through. You can definitely go through at your leisure, actually. Again, these are some examples of criminal contamination of food products. Okay, I think in the previous slide, I just made a mention about food safety chain. These are the various sectors of food chain. You have crop producers, feed producers, primary food producers, food manufacturers, secondary food manufacturers, wholesaler, retailer, consumers, etc., etc. All these entities constitute what is known as a food chain. Now let's see something about threat analysis critical control point. Safety of the food has been the main concern of food industry over the past half a century. Again, I think it has really gained momentum these days, but food safety has been the main concern of food for years, actually. Okay. So that is why people came up with the HACCP system. Okay, but the HACCP principles, they only take care of food safety, but intention. That is meant for unintentional contamination, but not intentional. Whereas food fraud and food security or food defense, they come under intentional contamination, actually, as we saw in one of the previous slides. Okay, the definition of TACCP again is a systematic management of risk through the evaluation of threats, identification of vulnerabilities, and implementation of controls required for materials and products, even in purchasing, your processes, premises, and distribution network. So that the system that you develop, that is TACCP system, should look into all these areas, materials, purchasing process, premises, distribution network, etc., etc. Okay. And the aim of implementing a TACCP system, TACCP system, is to reduce the likelihood and consequence of a deliberate attack, and protect against organizational disreputation, reassure customers and public that steps have been taken to protect food from intentional contamination, and demonstrate that reasonable precautions are taken and due diligence is exercised in protecting food. So the aim of implementing a TACCP system, or rather the objectives of implementing a TACCP system, are these things. So what are the various processes? What are the various steps involved in TACCP? So there are some 15 steps. I'm just going to read out from the slide. First, you have to assess the new information. Okay. And then identify and assess threats to organization. identify individuals and or groups which may be a threat to organization, and assess their motivation, capability, and determination. Will they really create problems, etc., etc. And the third step is identify individuals and or groups which may be a threat to specific operation. Okay. In the previous step, that was purely general. You have to assess their motivation, capability, and determination. Whereas in step 3, you are focusing on the threat specific to some of your operations. It could be premises, it could be factory, it could be site, it could be related to purchasing, etc., etc. Then select a product which is representative of a particular process. Then after that, you have to select a product that is representative of a particular. You may be producing several products, but you just select a product from one of those lines and subject that to TACCP. Like what you do, it's very similar to HACCP. Then identify the individuals and the groups that may want to target the specific product. So whoever is going to be the threat, maybe an individual, maybe a group, okay, that you have to identify the group or the individual. Then draw a process flowchart for the product. You have selected a product. Then after that, you select a flowchart. It's not exactly a process flowchart, but it's a process flowchart related to threats. Okay, you need to pay special attention to less transparent parts of the supply chain. Basically, you're going to identify the threats from several sources, similar to identifying hazards in your process steps. You're going to do the threats. What threats can come from step A, step B, step C, things like that. That is what you're doing in step 6. And step number 7 is identify the vulnerable points. It is similar to identifying critical control points or control points. Identify the vulnerable points where you feel the attacker might get some success in. So basically, you are focusing on those points that are vulnerable to attack by the individual or the group. And after that, identify possible threats appropriate to the product at each step. Basically, you focus, the previous one you focused on specific, but then you continue that exercise and identify all possible threats to the product at each and every step. Okay, let's move on to step 9, which is select the points in the process where the threat would have the most effect and where they might best be detected. Okay, which is this is some of the steps may have the full impact from the threat, so you have to select those points, and that should also be easily detectable. Next step is assess the likelihood of routine control procedures detecting such a threat. Okay, what is the likelihood of it's again some kind of risk management approach. Okay, what is the probability? What is the severity? Again, these things are quite common in the HACCP system. Similarly, you are assessing the likelihood of the threat happening, and what about the impact of those things? So that is step 11 and 12. Okay. Step number 13 is where you identified and record and also agree and implement some kind of preventive action. So basically, this is something like your critical control point. So you are identifying and implementing certain procedures to mitigate the risk. The HACCP, rather the TACCP team, basically it should have a confidential reporting and recording procedures that allow the management action on those decisions. It has to be confidential, otherwise I think if it is leaked, then it's of no value. You know, people will come to know, and then you may not be able to implement the control step. So that means I think the TACCP team should keep the information confidential. And step 14 is determine and review the arrangement for TACCP evaluation. Once in a while, you determine and review the adequacy of the TACCP system. And finally, maintain a routine watch of official and industry publications. So basically, you are just scanning the literature, scanning the information for, scanning the public information for, you know, any new development, etc., etc. So these are the 15 steps involved in the TACCP plan preparation. Here I have given some kind of scoring, actually, if you want to, you know, make use of it. I'm not saying it's a requirement, but if you want to make use of it, you can do so. Common sense approach, you know, likelihood is categorized into very high chance, some chance, may happen, unlikely to happen. This has been taken from publicly available standard 96. So you give a score of 5, very high chance of occurrence. So give a score of 5, high chance of occurrence, 4, and things like that. So what will be the impact? The top one is catastrophic, then you have major, significant, things like that. Okay. So the next few slides, I'll provide further guidance on how to design and implement the TACCP system, actually. Here, the purpose is to prevent break-ins in buildings, facilities, and storage sites. So this is basically physical protection of access measure, control measures, controlled access, that's what you call. So this involves perimeter physical protection, where you may be marking certain areas no entry. You may be putting some surveillance devices such as video, etc., etc., and also you may be installing break-in or breaching detection devices, you know, like alarms and things like that. The other one is physical protection of access to buildings, facilities, and storage sites, where you may have, you know, you may be closing off access to certain areas, like for instance, loading, unloading docks and things like that. You may be putting, you may be fitting grills or bars or things like that for your windows and all kinds of things. Okay. The third one is intrusion prevention and detection in facilities. Again, you talk about alarm systems and video surveillance systems, video cameras, etc., etc., and access to stocks, production, products, basically. Okay, so you may have all these control systems in place. Now let's see what is there in the control traffic flows. So again, the purpose is to rapidly detect any suspect behavior inside a site. So you have vehicular flow, flow of persons, flow of goods, etc., etc. Okay, and you know, you have to put in place a traffic and parking plan. You may come up with a parking. You may come up with a plan for traffic. You know, what should be the movement of people. How do you prevent people from accessing other areas, and what is your parking plan, etc. And also you may segregate or separate visitors and staff parking areas. You may like to keep an eye on any strange vehicles parked outside. Or you may be setting up a system for controlling vehicles entering and exiting the site. So there are so many things that can be done under vehicular flow. What about flow of persons, actually? Okay. One second. So in the case of movement of people, flow of persons, you may identify some sensitive areas. Basically, you will analyze the internal processes for determining the most sensitive areas and limit the access to these areas. And you will have to manage access by individuals. So basically, you'll have to differentiate between staff and non-staff members, who can access these areas, who cannot access these areas. And depending on the level of sensitivity identifier, maybe you can, you can issue badges, you can issue some kind of codes. You may like to differentiate by giving different uniforms and things like that. These are some ways by which you can manage access to these areas. And similarly, you may keep a log of entries and exits. Keep a log for entry of all persons entering and leaving the facility. And you may also draw up a list indicating the name of, or rather names of people that normally are allowed on site, and the names of outside individuals who have appointments, etc., who have to come to your facility for doing some work, okay? And you may have to deal with any discrepancy in accordance with established procedures. So that means you have to come up with procedures for deviation. Should there be any deviation, in your access control and things like that? How do you deal with all those things? You have to come up with procedures, okay? Again, identification, we talk about identification of staff, issue different kind of clothing, uniforms, and things like that. Control the access systems, control the flow of goods. Under control of the flow of goods, you have receiving of goods, you have storage of goods, and things like that, all these things. For instance, in the case of reception of goods, this is under inventory management. Under reception of goods, you may like to verify the documents, such as the origin of goods, volume, date and time they left, etc., etc. Similarly, you may also be, if you are receiving tankers, for instance, you may like to verify the integrity of tankers. You'll be checking the seals, etc., etc. And also, you may be checking the procedure for cleaning. Their cleaning records, etc., upon receiving the tankers. And you have to establish a clear procedure for special cases of the return of goods. If you're receiving return goods, I think you need to be more careful, because that might have an impact on your threat analysis. So I think you need to control all these things. Also, you will have stocking and destocking. That is again under inventory management. You need to secure your storage areas, and you will ensure that packaging and other materials are completely intact, and you store them appropriately. Okay. Shipment of products is also included in inventory management. Okay. You will have dedicated spaces for shipment. Okay, and check to make sure that shipment matches the order. Okay, date, nature, quantity, etc. And make sure they are intact. That is, if it is hermetically sealed, make sure that it is hermetically sealed and not tampered with. Or does it have stretch wrapping or shrink wrapping, that kind of thing. So all these things you need to check when you ship your products. Okay, if you have hazardous materials, then there are certain, like cleaning products, pest control products, etc. If you handle all these things in your facility, you have to make sure that these are put in place. These are put in appropriate places and properly identified and accessed. Okay. Then you have other things such as water security, lab security. If you have a microbiological lab, you need to exercise some control so that it's not subject to any kind of malicious contamination. Rather, I think if you're handling pathogenic cultures, for instance, there is a possibility of that getting stolen somehow, and people might just add to the product. So that is why lab security is very important. Okay. We also have process-related threat analysis and computer security analysis. We are talking about information security and all that. Okay. Yeah, let's move on to the other one. These are the methods of threat assessment. First, you conduct a risk analysis and evaluate any significant risks and exposures, significant risk to product, process, computers, etc., etc. We saw everything in the previous slides. And the next step is to determine the critical points for controlling the security. Okay, and determine procedures and technical means of verifying each critical point to control security. First, in the previous step, you are determining the critical points related to the threats. And then the third one is procedures for verifying those critical points. And like in the case of HACCP, you'll have a corrective action procedure for any deviations. So that is what that's the fourth step is. Determine the corrective measure to be implemented when the surveillance reveals that a critical point for security control is no longer controlled. If there was a security breach, if there was a big deviation, then I think you need to have some kind of corrective measures. And step number 5 is apply verification procedures in order to confirm that the system is functioning effectively. So monitoring and then verifying. Somebody has to verify that the system is working effectively. And the last step is so basically you are building up a file which includes all procedures and reports related to threat assessment. So these are the 6 steps of TACCP. Now let's see the VASP system. Actually, this talks about vulnerability analysis and critical control point. Okay, a typical feature of economically motivated adulteration, that is EMA, is the substitution of a low-cost item in place of a relatively high-cost ingredient, high-cost component. The VASP system actually, or rather the VASP team, needs to be alert to the availability of such alternatives. Okay, an example where this may happen is when added value is claimed. Say, for instance, somebody is claiming organic, non-GMO, locally grown, and things like that, free range, poultry, and things like that. So these are some examples of some added value claims. And basically, this is substitution. So you'll be asking these questions in if you're in the VASP team, VSACP team, you will be asking these questions. Are low-cost substitute materials available? Are there any low-cost materials available for this particular ingredient? have there been significant material cost increase? I mean, I'm talking about the original material. Did the cost actually increase in the recent past? Has pressure increased on suppliers' trading margins? So when the profit margin gets reduced, there is a tendency to substitute with cheaper items. Okay. And the other question is, do you actually trust your suppliers, managers, and their managers are not actually persons, but whoever manages suppliers and managers who manage suppliers. So that kind of question you should ask yourself. Do these key suppliers use personnel security practices? What are their personnel security practices? Do your suppliers think that you monitor their operation and analyze their products? They should know that you're having control on their systems and their products. So these are some of the questions you should ask if you are a VASP team member. Okay. And there are more questions. Which suppliers are routinely audited or not routinely audited? Are we supplied? Do you get supplies through remote, obscure chains, unknown supply chains? Do you get materials from unknown chains? So you should be cognizant of these things also. Or are major materials becoming less available due to crop failure, for instance? Or you have plentiful of some material. Some material is available aplenty because of overproduction. So you should ask such questions. Has there been any increase or decrease in demand? So I have given on this slide, also in the previous slide, a few questions that you should ask as a member of the VASP team. So the method of vulnerability assessment, like in the previous case, TACCP, here also in the VASP system, first you do the risk analysis, and again you determine the critical points for controlling the fraud. There it was security, here it is fraud. So then you determine the procedures to verify each critical point, okay, and come up with procedures for deviations. That means corrective action procedures for deviation, and apply those procedures. Have an effective verification system, and again build up a file that includes all procedures and reports concerning. Basically you are building up a file that contains all the procedures. So that is your. These are the methods of vulnerability assessment. Okay, what about FSMA and food fraud? Again, FSMA is very, it places a lot of importance on food fraud. But remember, I think as far as FSMA is concerned, if it is for economically motivated adulteration, and if it's not going to result in any illness or injury, so that means it's not a hazard. And hazard by definition is an agent that can cause illness or injury. So if it is not going to cause illness or injury, it's not a hazard as far as FSMA is concerned. So you have to include only those hazards that can cause illness or injury. And obviously, I think when you identify some hazards like that, you may have to come up with appropriate preventive controls. And more often, the preventive control for the identified hazards, economically motivated adulterant under FSMA, is supply chain control. Okay. What about GFSI requirements? So these are the GFSI requirements of food fraud. You must document, and whoever is certified to some of these standards, GFSI standards, these are the requirements under GFSI. Document the food fraud vulnerability, and that's why, you know, whether it's BRC or SQF or any other GFSI standard, requires you to document the assessment, vulnerability assessment. And once you have done the documentation, make sure that these are implemented effectively. And annually you conduct a review of your food fraud system. And the next one is confirm these things meet the GFSI scope of all food product, because some of them may not be under the GFSI scope. GFSI has got the various scopes. Actually, if you visit GFSI website, you can get all these, all the information actually. Okay. I have given you some statistics on this particular slide. Again, some organizations are very active in coming up with useful sources of information. This is one useful source of information, that is USB food fraud database. So they have identified more than 2,000 reported cases of food fraud. And the level of food fraud, it's not a guesstimate, but it's some actual number. It is about 10% of your total materials received or materials produced. So 10% is a big number actually. And the cost to the global food industry because of food fraud, it's about 30 to 40 billions actually. So anyway, thank you very much for listening to the webinar. And if you want the information, actually, we can forward the slide to you. Please contact PGRFSI and we will forward the information to you. If you have any questions, now I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your time. No questions anyway. Thank you very much.